The rain hammered against the windows of the grand Victorian mansion like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of 30 years of buried pain. Alexander Blackwood stood in the marble foyer of 1847, Rosewood Drive, the very house where his childhood had died a violent death, and felt his heart crack open like thunder. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now owned every brick, every floorboard, every shadow that had once witnessed his destruction. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the same tiles where his bare feet had once been dragged across broken glass by the woman who gave him life, only to take it away piece by piece. "Welcome home, Mr. Blackwood," his assistant Miranda Chin whispered behind him, her voice barely audible above the storm that seemed to rage both outside and within his chest. But Alexander heard something else in the distance, the sound of desperate sobbing echoing from the master bedroom upstairs, the same bedroom where his mother Victoria Ashford had once locked him in a closet for 3 days without food because he'd accidentally broken her favorite crystal vase. The same bedroom where his father, Charles Ashford, had beaten him unconscious at age 8 for crying too loudly during one of their dinner parties. They were here. They had come, just as he knew they would, drawn by the legal documents Miranda had delivered that morning, documents that would strip them of everything they'd ever owned, everything they'd ever loved, just as they had stripped him of his childhood, his innocence, his very soul. Alexander's mind drifted back to that November night 30 years ago when he was only 9 years old, standing in this very foyer wearing nothing but torn pajamas and clutching a stuffed elephant named Winston that his grandmother had given him before she died. Victoria had towered over him like a beautiful demon, her emerald eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it seemed to burn the air around them. "You are not our child," she had hissed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his thin shoulders until they drew blood. "You are a mistake, a burden, a curse that has brought nothing but misery to this family." Charles had stood behind her like a coward, his expensive suit wrinkled from another night of drinking, his bloodshot eyes filled with the same disgust that Alexander had seen every day of his young life. The adoption agency made an error, Charles had slurred, his breath reeking of whiskey and failure. "You're not the child we ordered. You're damaged goods, and we're returning you to where you belong, the gutter." The memory of being thrown onto the rain-soaked streets in the middle of the night, clutching Winston and watching the only home he'd ever known disappear behind iron gates, still made Alexander's hands shake with rage. He remembered running through the storm, his bare feet bleeding on the broken pavement, screaming for help that never came. He remembered the social worker, Mrs. Patterson, finding him collapsed under a bridge 3 days later, more dead than alive, and the look of horror in her eyes when she realized what had happened. He remembered the foster homes that followed, 12 of them in 5 years, each one teaching him that love was a luxury he could never afford, that trust was a weakness that would only lead to more pain. But what his adoptive parents never could have imagined was that their cruelty had forged something unbreakable inside their unwanted son. By age 14, Alexander was earning money by tutoring older students in mathematics and writing. By 16, he'd started his first business, a small computer repair shop run out of his foster family's garage. By 18, he'd earned a full scholarship to Harvard Business School, where he graduated summa cum laude with a photographic memory that retained every slight, every injustice, every moment of humiliation he'd ever endured. And by 35, he'd built Blackwood Enterprises into a global empire worth $12 billion, all while never forgetting the faces of the 2 people who had taught him that the world was a battlefield where only the strongest survived. Now, as he climbed the mahogany staircase that had once seemed as tall as a mountain to his 9-year-old eyes, Alexander could hear Victoria's voice pleading through the bedroom door like a broken record. "Please, whoever you are, there must be some mistake. We've lived in this house for 40 years. This is our home. You can't just take everything from us." Her voice cracked with the same desperation Alexander had felt as a child, begging them not to abandon him in the storm. The poetic justice of the moment was almost too perfect to bear. He pushed open the bedroom door to find them exactly as he'd expected, Victoria sitting on the edge of the king-sized bed where she'd once planned his abandonment, her once golden hair now silver and thin, her face lined with age and guilt. Charles stood by the window in a ratty bathrobe, his shoulders slumped with defeat, the powerful businessman facade he'd once worn now crumbled into pathetic fragments. They looked up at him with the wide-eyed terror of cornered animals, and for a moment, neither seemed to recognize the man standing before them. "Hello, Mother." "Hello, Father," Alexander said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of accumulated pain and power. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." The color drained from Victoria's face as recognition dawned like a horrible sunrise. Her hands flew to her mouth as if she could somehow take back 30 years of cruelty with a single gesture. Charles stumbled backward against the window, his reflection in the rain-streaked glass looking like a ghost of the man who had once thrown a 9-year-old boy into the street to die. "Alexander?" Victoria whispered, her voice barely human. But you're supposed to be dead. We never heard from you again. We thought." Charles completed her sentence with the hollow resignation of a man who had finally run out of lies to tell himself. "We thought you'd died on the streets. We told everyone you'd gone to live with relatives in Europe. Oh God, what have we done?" Alexander moved closer, his presence filling the room like gathering darkness. "What you did was create a monster," he said quietly, his voice more terrifying in its calmness than any scream could have been. "You took a child who loved you unconditionally and taught him that love is just another word for weakness. You showed him that family is just a pretty word people use to hide their capacity for evil. And now that child has grown up, and he's come home to collect the debt you owe him." Victoria began to weep with the broken sobs of someone who had finally understood the true cost of their choices. "Alexander, please, we were young, we were scared, we didn't know how to be parents. The agency told us you had problems, behavioral issues. We thought we were doing what was best for everyone." But Alexander cut through her excuses like a sword through paper. Best for everyone except the 9-year-old boy who spent 3 days under a bridge eating garbage and drinking rainwater to survive. Best for everyone except the teenager who worked 3 jobs while studying for his SATs because no one would ever take care of him again. Best for everyone except the man who learned that the only person he could ever trust was himself. Charles finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Son, please, we know we made terrible mistakes. We've regretted it every day for 30 years. We tried to find you, we hired private investigators, Alexander's laugh was like breaking glass. "You tried to find me? You hired investigators? That's interesting, because according to the tax records I've reviewed, you've been claiming me as a dependent for the last 25 years to get adoption tax credits. You've been profiting from my abandonment while pretending to search for me. How beautifully twisted." The truth hit them like a physical blow, and Victoria collapsed backward onto the bed as if her strings had been cut. Charles pressed his face against the window, his tears mixing with the rain on the other side of the glass. "What do you want from us?" he whispered. "Money? The house? Everything we own. Take it all. We deserve to lose everything." Alexander walked to the fireplace where his childhood portrait had once hung, the same portrait they'd burned the night they threw him away, and turned to face the 2 broken people who had shaped his destiny with their cruelty. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for you to experience exactly what I experienced. I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything you've ever loved, to be thrown out into a world that doesn't care whether you live or die, to understand that the people you trusted most were the ones most willing to destroy you." But as Alexander spoke these words, he noticed something that stopped him cold. On Victoria's nightstand was a small, faded photograph of him as a child, standing in this very room, smiling with the innocent trust that only children possess. Beside it was a newspaper clipping from 5 years ago with the headline, "Young Entrepreneur Builds Business Empire," and a picture of Alexander receiving an award for humanitarian work. Victoria had been following his success all these years, carrying the weight of her guilt like a cancer in her chest. "You kept that," Alexander said, pointing to the photograph with a voice that had lost some of its steel edge. Victoria looked up at him through her tears, her face a map of 3 decades of regret. "I kept everything," she whispered. "Every report card the foster families sent, every newspaper article about your achievements, every piece of evidence that the child we threw away had become everything we could never be. I've lived with the knowledge that we destroyed the most precious thing we ever had, and I've died a little more each day because of it." Charles turned from the window, his face streaked with tears and something that looked almost like relief at finally being able to speak the truth. "We were monsters, Alexander. Young, selfish, unprepared monsters who thought children were accessories you could return when they didn't match your lifestyle. But watching you succeed, seeing you build something beautiful out of the ashes we left you with, it's been the only thing that's kept us from ending our own misery. We don't deserve forgiveness. We don't deserve mercy. We deserve whatever justice you've come here to deliver." Alexander stood in the silence that followed, feeling 30 years of carefully constructed rage beginning to crack like ice in spring. This wasn't how he'd imagined this moment during all those sleepless nights when he'd planned their destruction. He'd expected them to make excuses, to deny responsibility, to prove that they were still the same heartless creatures who had thrown him away. But seeing them broken by their own guilt, consumed by 3 decades of knowing they'd committed the unforgivable, somehow made his victory feel hollow. "Do you know what the worst part was?" Alexander asked, his voice softer now but still carrying the weight of ancient pain. "It wasn't the hunger or the cold or even the fear. It was the moment I realized that I meant so little to you that you could throw me away like garbage without a second thought. It was understanding that the 2 people who were supposed to love me no matter what had decided I wasn't worth the effort it would take to try." Victoria rose from the bed and moved toward him with the careful steps of someone approaching a wounded animal. "You were worth everything," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You were the most beautiful, intelligent, loving child any parent could hope for. And we were too damaged, too selfish, too afraid of being real parents to see what a gift we'd been given. We didn't throw you away because you weren't good enough, Alexander. We threw you away because we weren't good enough for you." The words hung in the air like a revelation, and Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. "You destroyed my childhood," he said quietly. "You stole my innocence, my ability to trust, my faith in human decency. You turned me into someone who sees the world as a war zone where love is just another weapon people use to hurt each other." Charles stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "And despite everything we did to you, you became a man who builds schools for orphan children. You became someone who creates opportunities for abandoned kids to find their way in the world. You became everything we should have been but were too broken to become. You didn't let our cruelty turn you into us, Alexander. You transformed it into something that helps other children avoid the hell we put you through." Alexander looked around the room where his nightmares had been born, and for the first time in 30 years, he saw it through different eyes. He saw 2 young, scared, unprepared people who had made the worst possible choice and had lived with the consequences every day since. He saw the portrait on the nightstand, the newspaper clippings, the evidence of parents who had never stopped loving the child they'd been too damaged to raise. And he saw the man he'd become despite their failures, not because of his rage, but because he'd chosen to break the cycle of cruelty rather than perpetuate it. "I came here tonight planning to destroy you," Alexander said, his voice carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller. "I was going to take your home, your money, your dignity, everything you'd ever cared about. I was going to make you feel as powerless and abandoned as you made me feel. And legally, I still can. The foreclosure papers are real, the debt collection is legitimate, and I have the power to leave you with nothing." Victoria and Charles exchanged a look that spoke of shared resignation and acceptance. "We understand," Victoria said softly. "We deserve whatever you decide to do to us. We've had 30 years to prepare for this moment, and we know there's no punishment you could give us that's worse than what we've already done to ourselves." But Alexander surprised them both by walking to the window and looking out at the storm that was finally beginning to calm. "The difference between you and me," he said without turning around, "is that when I was given the power to choose between love and cruelty, between mercy and revenge, I chose to be better than the people who raised me. I chose to break the cycle instead of continuing it. He turned back to face them, and in his eyes, they saw not the cold fury they'd expected, but something far more powerful, the wisdom of someone who had learned to transform pain into purpose. "I'm not going to destroy you," Alexander said quietly. "I'm going to give you something you never gave me, a second chance. But it comes with conditions." Victoria and Charles looked at him with the desperate hope of people who had been offered redemption they knew they didn't deserve. "Anything," Charles said immediately. "We'll do anything to try to make amends for what we did." Alexander pulled out a legal document from his jacket and placed it on the dresser. "This house will become a home for abandoned children, the Alexander Blackwood Foundation for Displaced Youth. You'll both work there as volunteers, helping kids who've been thrown away just like I was. You'll dedicate the rest of your lives to making sure no other child experiences what I experienced. And maybe, if you prove that you've truly changed, we can begin the long process of learning what it means to be a family." Victoria collapsed to her knees, overcome by emotion and gratitude she had no right to expect. "Alexander, we don't deserve this. We don't deserve your forgiveness or your mercy. Why would you give us a chance to redeem ourselves after what we did?" Alexander looked down at the woman who had given birth to him and then thrown him away, and saw not the monster he'd carried in his heart for 30 years, but a broken human being who had made the worst possible choice and had lived with the consequences ever since. "Because someone once told me that the measure of a person isn't determined by the worst thing they've ever done, but by what they choose to do after they realize how wrong they were. Because I learned that carrying hatred is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And because the child you threw away grew up to understand that love isn't something you earn by being perfect, it's something you choose to give despite imperfection." Charles moved toward his son with trembling steps, his arms extended in a gesture that asked for something he had no right to request. Would it be possible? Could I hug you?" Alexander looked at the man who had once beaten him unconscious, and felt 30 years of carefully guarded armor beginning to crack. Not because the pain was gone, it would always be there, a scar on his soul that could never fully heal, but because he had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about refusing to let the past define the future. "We have a lot of work to do," Alexander said as he allowed himself to be embraced by the father who had abandoned him. "This won't erase what happened. It won't give me back my childhood or take away the nightmares or instantly make us a family. But maybe, if we're all willing to do the hard work of healing, we can build something new from the ashes of what was destroyed." Victoria joined the embrace, and for the first time in 30 years, Alexander felt something he thought was lost forever, the possibility that even the most broken things could be repaired if people were willing to put in the effort to fix them. "I love you, son," Victoria whispered against his shoulder. "I've loved you every day since the moment I realized what we'd done, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prove that love is real." As the storm outside finally began to clear, Alexander looked around the room where his childhood had ended and his real life had begun. Tomorrow, this house would be filled with the laughter of children who needed to know that being abandoned didn't mean being unlovable. Tomorrow, he would begin the hardest work of his life, not building a business empire, but building bridges across 30 years of pain and mistrust. And tomorrow, Victoria and Charles would begin their own journey of redemption, learning that being a parent isn't about perfection, it's about showing up every day and choosing love over fear. The rain had stopped, and through the window, Alexander could see the first stars beginning to appear in the clearing sky. He thought about the 9-year-old boy who had been thrown out into a storm just like this one, clutching a stuffed elephant and believing that the world was nothing but cruelty and abandonment. That boy could never have imagined that 30 years later, he would return to this house not as a victim seeking revenge, but as a man who had learned that the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemies, it's transforming them into family. "Come on," Alexander said, stepping back from the embrace and looking at his parents with eyes that held both caution and hope. "We have a foundation to build, children to help, and a lifetime of healing to begin. The past is written in stone, but the future is written in the choices we make starting now." And as they walked together out of the room where so much pain had been borne, Alexander realized that sometimes the greatest revenge is refusing to become the very thing that hurt you, choosing instead to become the healing the world desperately needs. The abandoned child had finally come home, not to the house that had rejected him, but to the understanding that home isn't a place you're born into, it's a choice you make every day to build something better than what came before. And in that choice, both the abandoned and the abandoners found their path to redemption, proving that even the most broken stories can be rewritten by people brave enough to choose love over hatred, mercy over revenge, and hope over despair.